Millionaire catches his housekeeper with his twins. The secret is revealed. The crying was constant, piercing, exhausting. A sound that seeped through the walls, slid down the door frames, and spread like mold throughout the house. It was the kind of sound you didn't just hear. You felt it in your teeth. It throbbed at the base of your skull, corroded the air until it became impossible to breathe. Ricardo wandered through the house like a survivor. His gaze fixed, his eyes hollow, his shirt wrinkled. The twins were only 2 months old, and he no longer knew where the day ended and the night began. He slept in 10-minute windows, with one leg propped against the wall and the other still standing. Silence only existed in short, illusory intervals, a trap that always preceded another explosion of crying. The house, once alive, was now a museum of absence. The living room plants were dying. The lights stayed off during the day. The fridge, nearly empty, held only jars of frozen baby food and bottles far too clean to have been used. In the baby's room, everything was measured, aligned, controlled. Charts printed on the wall indicated exact times for feeding, changing, resting. The lighting was calibrated, the ambient sounds programmed. Veronica Salazar's psychological protocol executed with near military precision. Nothing worked. The babies cried as if they felt some ancestral terror, as if they somehow knew innately that something essential was missing, something Ricardo, with all his rationality, couldn't provide. Veronica said it was normal, that the system needed time, that too much affection could interfere with developing a healthy bond, that too much touch confused the brain, that predictability was love. Ricardo wanted to believe, not because he trusted her blindly, but because he didn't know what else to believe in. The world had gone off the rails the day Camilla died, and since then he had done whatever he could not to collapse completely. Camilla. She had been the center of everything, the light, the logic he never understood but always followed. Her death had left not only a void, but a constant doubt. What was he doing there, alone, with 2 babies who didn't recognize him, who screamed without end, who weren't to blame for anything and yet seemed to punish him with every tear? Veronica had become the bridge between him and sanity. She told him what to do, how to act, when to feed. She had solutions for everything. But with each passing day, control slipped away like sand through his fingers. It was in the middle of this hellish routine that Lucia Morales appeared. She arrived quietly, hired through an agency with simple duties: clean the house, keep things in order, prepare basic meals. No involvement with the babies. Ricardo didn't even interview her. He just signed the contract. The report said she was trustworthy. That was all he needed. In the first days, she seemed like part of the furniture. She moved silently, avoided the noise, did everything delicately, as if afraid to disturb the grief embedded in the walls. She didn't talk much, didn't look much, just tended to the house with silent precision. But Ricardo noticed something strange about her. A calmness that wasn't submission. A kind of presence that, even contained, filled spaces like a breeze in a closed room. It was on a Saturday morning that everything changed. The babies had woken early, and the crying had begun before the sunlight pierced the curtains. He tried everything: formula, changing, rocking the crib, the white noise app. Nothing. Exhausted, he left them in the crib and went downstairs as if carrying 20 pounds on each shoulder. He went to the kitchen looking for coffee. Nothing was ready. He sat at the table, hands covering his eyes. And then, silence. Not a gradual silence. Not a pause between cries. A silence total. Absolute. He rushed upstairs, but quietly. The bedroom door was ajar. When he looked inside, he froze. Lucia was sitting in the armchair, the 2 babies in her arms, one resting against her chest, the other on her lap, their faces calm, relaxed, as if they had never cried. She swayed her shoulders gently, almost imperceptibly, and hummed something in Spanish, an old maternal primal melody, a sound that didn't come from the brain. It came from the body, from the soul. Ricardo didn't enter, didn't interrupt. He stood there, in the shadow of the door, watching. It was in that moment that something inside him broke, not like a violent crack, more like a subtle fissure through which, for the first time, a warm light entered. What he saw there wasn't in the books. It wasn't in the protocol. It was something else, something older than technique. In the days that followed, he began to notice more. Lucia never disobeyed instructions, never interfered in decisions. But she found loopholes. If the babies cried while she cleaned the floor, she would approach quietly, murmur a song, touch them gently, and silence would return. It wasn't magic, it was presence. Ricardo tried to copy her. He picked up one of the babies the way she did, tried to rock them, his arms stiff, his spine straight, his muscles tense. The baby cried even more. He gave up, felt ashamed, but tried again and again. Veronica noticed the change. She made subtle comments, warnings disguised as care, said that poorly conducted interventions could distort attachment, that too much physical contact was a setback, that it was important to keep roles clear. Lucia was an employee, nothing more. But Ricardo no longer heard her the same way. For the first time, he began to doubt, not because he thought Veronica had bad intentions, but because he had started to see, to feel. That same week, one of the nights was different. He woke to the crying, as always, walked to the room, tired. But when he arrived, he saw Lucia there again, the two babies against her, the melody filling the air. Ricardo leaned against the doorframe, breathed deeply, almost let out a sound, but stayed silent. And there, in that simple scene, the last wall inside him broke. It wasn't just about the babies, it was about him, about allowing affection to enter where before there had only been method, about recognizing that maybe caring meant letting go of control, about accepting that love sometimes comes from where you least expect it, and that doesn't make it any less. It makes it real. That night, for the first time, Ricardo slept with the door ajar. And for the first time, the babies also slept until morning. Ricardo's hands trembled less and less. It was still strange, still hard, but that absolute fear of touching was gone. He no longer saw his own children as unbreakable enigmas, as creatures too fragile to be held. Little by little, he began to recognize the exact weight of each of them. The way their bodies molded to his, the pause in their crying, even if just for seconds, when he managed to rock them with the right rhythm. It was by watching Lucia that he learned, not consciously, like someone studying a technique, but with the intuition of a man who could no longer bear to repeat dead formulas. In recent days, he spent more time nearby, not as supervision, as learning. He noticed how she used her whole body to comfort, the warmth of her chest, the sway of her hips, the constant murmur. Even when there were no words, it was a silent dance, and the babies somehow knew the choreography. Ricardo didn't understand how, but it worked. He tried to copy her in silence, first with the boy, then with the girl, one at a time. He began to hum softly, not real songs, just sounds, sounds like Lucia's. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But he was there, present, something that once had seemed impossible. The crying still came, of course. There were still long nights. But the terror had given way to something more bearable, something like hope, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was learning. Veronica didn't like it. She noticed the change in the notes. The schedules were less rigid. The reports came with fewer technical terms, more human ones. One night with no exact record. A feeding that didn't follow the timetable. A nap taken in arms instead of in the crib. All of it triggered her alarms. She asked for a conversation. In a neutral tone, she reinforced that emotional predictability was the foundation of good parenting, that the method was being compromised, that interference from untrained people could cause distortions that were difficult to repair, that Lucia, although careful, wasn't authorized to handle the babies, that it was important to keep roles clear, boundaries defined. Ricardo didn't answer. He just listened, jaw locked, fists clenched in his pockets. She spoke as if his children were patients, as if their pain could be organized into graphs, as if spontaneous affection were a flaw in the system, as if Camila hadn't died and left everything collapsing. That night he climbed the stairs with heavy steps. The twins were restless. Lucia had already left. He tried to calm them on his own, used the cloth the way he'd seen her do, rocked them the same way, tried the same song. But they cried, deep, wounded, inconsolable. With each failed attempt, he felt smaller, defeated, useless. For 3 days, he followed Veronica's recommendation to the letter, kept Lucia out of the room, asked her to stay away from the babies for precaution. She nodded in silence, didn't protest, but her eyes said what her mouth did not, a kind of contained pain, like someone who already knew what was coming. And it came. The crying got worse, sharper, longer, more desperate. The babies seemed less like children and more like alarms, screaming for something that no longer existed in that space. Ricardo tried to resist, clung to the method, but each night was crueler than the last. On the 3rd night, he broke. He left the room shirtless, eyes red, arms trembling, walked into the hallway, knocked on Lucia's door, said nothing. She saw him and understood. Rose in silence, followed him to the room, took the babies. Within minutes, the crying stopped. Peace returned. Ricardo sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his head bowed. He didn't cry, not with tears, but something inside him sank, like a city slowly collapsing beneath the earth. He felt guilty, weak, lost. Lucia didn't say a word, but when she came closer and looked at him, it was as if she said everything. She handed him one of the babies. He held on. She adjusted his hands gently. He accepted. For the first time, Ricardo rocked his own child with confidence. The baby nestled against his chest, took a deep breath. The small head fit perfectly in the hollow between shoulder and neck. It was a simple gesture, almost invisible. But for Ricardo, it was an entire universe. They stayed there, the 3 of them. No words, only the sound of breathing and silence, the good kind of silence, the silence that heals. The next morning, Ricardo didn't report anything to Veronica, didn't send an email, didn't jot down times, simply ignored the routine. And for the first time in weeks, he had coffee calmly, with one of the babies in his arms. Lucia passed through the kitchen, her hair tied back, a cup in her hand. Their eyes met. He nodded slightly. She smiled, and they went on. At this new rhythm, the house began to change. Nothing drastic, but the signs were there. A soft song playing during the day, the smell of fresh food in the air. A laugh, still rare but genuine, coming from one of the rooms. The babies smiled more, slept more. And Ricardo at last began to understand that it wasn't about technique, it was about presence. Veronica returned days later. She arrived with her usual folder, the charts, the reports. She noticed the absence of markings, asked questions. Ricardo was evasive, said things were calmer. She didn't seem satisfied, asked to speak with Lucia, to analyze the behaviors, to assess whether there was any kind of improper emotional interference. Ricardo refused, not aggressively, but firmly. He said Lucia was an employee, yes, but also a necessary presence, that the babies were better with her around, that maybe it was time to reconsider the methods. Veronica reacted with icy silence, cold eyes, a false nod. Before leaving, she left a warning that unregulated bonds could generate emotional dependency. She warned that this kind of relationship, if mishandled, could be mistaken for affection, but actually conceal unresolved trauma. Finally, she said her role was to ensure the babies had the best possible development, even if their grieving father couldn't recognize it. Ricardo didn't respond. The door closed, and he knew in that instant that a line had been crossed, not by him, by her. In the days that followed, he reopened Camilla's room, but not to hide. He opened the drawers, the boxes, looked for something he didn't know the name of, and something he felt was there, waiting for him, deep down. Meanwhile, the babies slept, not always, but they slept, and so did he. In the living room, the clock kept marking the hours, but finally they were starting to make sense. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. There was still noise, of course. Babies didn't know what complete silence was. But now the sound was different. The crying was no longer a scream of despair. It was simply part of the routine, something human, normal. And little by little, Ricardo began to recognize it not as his own failure, but as a call, an invitation to presence. What once was fear had now become instinct. He knew, for example, that the boy cried harder before feedings, that the girl grew restless when the room was too bright, that both of them had a kind of sigh after falling asleep that meant deep sleep. These details, imperceptible weeks before, now guided him. Lucia remained there, like an invisible thread stitching everything together. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was the person Ricardo looked for whenever his arms failed, whenever the baby's eyes searched for something he still didn't know how to give. She never intruded, never imposed herself. She simply appeared when needed and filled what was missing with a touch, a song, a pause. Veronica was absent. Something in their last encounter had cooled the dynamic between them. Not that there had been a fight, but the trust, once automatic, was now fragile. Ricardo still received her reports, her recommendations, her professional messages, but he read them with distance. He was beginning to see, behind the technical language, control disguised as care. Camilla. Her name came more often now, not as pain, but as presence. As if, in the most unexpected moments, he could hear her inside his own head. Maybe an instinct of his, or something more. It was on a stifling afternoon that he decided to open the boxes in her room. He had avoided them from the beginning. The clothes, the objects, the books, everything remained untouched. But that day, he felt he had to. He was looking for a specific document to resolve an issue with the health plan. He thought it was in the closet. It wasn't. The search led him to the top of the shelf. There, he found a small brown cardboard box, taped at the edges. No label, no name. Inside, he found the letters. There were many, all handwritten, some folded, others still inside envelopes. The paper smelled of her. The handwriting was familiar, rounded, intense, as if she wrote with her whole body. Ricardo sat on the bed and began to read. The first spoke of fear, the fear of childbirth, the fear of not coming back. But it wasn't chaotic venting. It was organized thought, lucid, almost serene. Camilla didn't deny the risk. She named it, and by naming it, she tamed it. She wrote that if something happened, she wanted the babies to know they had been wanted, that they had been deeply loved even before they were born. In another, she wrote about Lucia. Ricardo read it 3 times before he understood. Camilla said she had met Lucia at the hospital months earlier. She told how Lucia, then a temporary caregiver in a pediatric ward, treated children with a kind of affection you didn't see in protocols. She said that if there were any complications, if by chance she couldn't be present, she wanted Lucia to be around the children, that they would need someone like her, with a warm body, a firm voice, and hands that knew how to hold pain without spreading it. Ricardo sat in silence for minutes. Then he picked up more letters, read one, then another, and began to see a pattern. Camilla also mentioned Veronica, but the tone was different, cautious, ambiguous. In one of the pages, she described how Veronica tried to intervene in everything, in the baby's names, in the choices for the nursery, in the pregnancy routine. She called it help, but there was a subtle unease. Camilla didn't fully trust her. She wrote that Veronica seemed to want to mold decisions according to her own theories, that there was an obsession with control that kept her on alert. Ricardo felt betrayed by something he hadn't known was happening. It was like waking in a room he thought he knew and realizing there were hidden doors. He began to recall small things, decisions Veronica had made without consulting him, corrections in reports with no explanation, comments about Lucia that now sounded biased. In the following days, he investigated cautiously. First, old conversations on his phone, then emails between Camilla and Veronica, small tensions, requests for space that weren't respected. He asked a lawyer friend to do some informal digging. The result came quickly. Veronica had been involved in at least 2 controversial cases of family intervention, nothing officially recorded, but whispers, insinuations, muffled complaints. Ricardo began avoiding any new contact with her, didn't reply to messages, didn't update the schedule. Silence. Until one morning, Veronica showed up. She arrived unannounced, accompanied by a social worker. She carried a folder of documents, said that given the rupture in follow-up, she needed to evaluate the environment, that the baby's emotional health might be at risk, that Lucia's role deserved deeper analysis, that straying from the protocol suggested possible parental imbalance. Ricardo listened, Camilla's letters still fresh in his memory. He looked at Lucia, who was coming down the hallway with one of the babies in her arms. She stopped, sensing the tension in the air. The baby was calm, sleeping. Ricardo made a subtle gesture for her to stay. She understood. The confrontation was still to come. But something inside him was already decided. Veronica had crossed a line that no justification could undo. What remained now was to gather everything. The letters, the memories, the evidence, and above all, the truth. Sometimes it's not who arrives first. It's who stays when everything falls apart. Have you ever had someone like that? Or have you ever been that person for someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting for you here.